Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining this ICL webinar on managing anthracnose. A couple of starting points, maybe start with an introduction. My name is Andy Owen. I am the International Technical Manager for ICL, and I'm joined today by my colleague Henry Bechelet, who's the Technical Manager for the UK and Ireland. And we're here today just to run through some best management advice on anthracnose. Now, probably some of you will have seen that the ICL account UK and Ireland have pushed out 3 short technical updates, effectively conversations between Henry, myself and Kate Entwistle, talking a little bit about anthracnose. And we've also pushed out an anthracnose quiz, which some of you have answered, and I think the interest has been good. It shows that there's clearly a discussion we need to have about managing anthracnose and best management advice, and that's what we're here to do today. Before we start, just to cover a couple of points. First is all the delegates or everybody viewing are currently on mute. You'll stay on mute throughout the webinar, but if you do have questions for us, you should be able to open the GoToWebinar dialog box. There should be a tab called questions, and you should be able to type your questions into there. Henry will be keeping an eye on questions, and he might pitch some out to me as we're going through the webinar, but if he doesn't do that, then we will cover off the questions at the end. Okay, so hopefully that's good.
Sorry.
We can get moving. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about managing anthracnose, looking at the best management advice. I guess the first slide would be, hey, why anthracnose, and why now? And the answer to that would be, well, anthracnose is probably the second most significant disease for cool season turfgrass in North Europe, after Microdochium, as covered on the Syngenta Greencast website. And Henry, if you want to join in now, why anthracnose and why now, do you think?
Well, yeah, now is traditionally the time when we'd start seeing it rear its ugly head, really, especially sort of if we have a decent summer, which the south of England is having at the moment. I think the southeast of England and the Low Countries, especially in Germany, watching the football last night, they've got a heat wave going on. The north of England is quite pleasant at the moment, but we're sort of well into the playing season, aren't we now? The surfaces have been prepared for a good while now, and that dovetailed with sort of high light levels and sort of maybe high temperatures, moisture stress, this, that, and the other. Now is the time when anthracnose can strike, and when it does strike, it can cause a lot of problems. So yeah, the reason why we're here now is because the time is now.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think a nice starting slide for us would be this Greenkeeper survey that the UK and Ireland carried out last year, survey of golf course managers, asking them which were their personal top 5 challenges to preparing high quality turf. And the results are very interesting, obviously very pertinent to this webinar, but top of the list was the management of turfgrass disease, okay? Because we know that a significant outbreak of disease can be devastating for our fine turf surfaces. And if we couple with that the fact that 1 or 2 active ingredients have been lost from the list over the last few years as well, then we need to be very understanding about how we manage these diseases on our turf surface. So this webinar links really well into those sort of personal challenges that people feel in preparing high quality turf. So we're focused on anthracnose, really important disease for a lot of grasses. Colletotrichum cereale, and you might have seen that or see that in the textbooks as Colletotrichum graminicola. A name actually changed a few years ago, but still floats around as that. And this is, a major turf grass disease for a range of host grasses. We generally identify it as being most serious for Poa annua, with a wide window of potential developing the disease, but also important for creeping bent as well. And if we think about how we best manage it in terms of what work has been done on the disease, well, we can look through all that information published in our industry and recorded on the turfgrass information files, and they would show, well, there's over 1,400 papers and articles and trade press mentions of anthracnose, which is a significant amount. But when you narrow those down, well, we're down to just over 40 refereed papers, so peer-reviewed journal articles that I can feel comfortable saying something about, because they will be based on clear replicated trial work, fairly robust studies with the right level of analysis done. And essentially, that's what we want to present to you today, this overview of the disease, but then linked to the existing research in these refereed papers, much of which focus on how we can adjust our cultural practices and put forward the best management advice for coping with the disease. Okay, so that's what we're going to cover. By way of introduction to anthracnose, well, it seems like we're seeing more and more anthracnose in modern golf, generally due to changes in management practices. These changes taking place to improve playing quality. So I'm talking about things like potentially lower heights of cut, talking about things like reduced nutritional inputs, particularly nitrogen, but as you will see, potassium as well is important. That chance of a longer or extended playing season where we're expecting our turf to perform for longer through the season, and potentially increased stress on the plant. There's a lot of stresses going on, of course, but one of the main ones we might see through the summer is this lower volumetric moisture content. So we're getting some drought stress effectively, as people are perhaps running their greens quite lean in terms of moisture content to improve firmness, to improve playing quality, that sort of thing. There's a nice discussion of all these in a master's thesis outside of from Rutgers University, where it considers all those impacts. And a lot of the work we'll present will talk around those management practices as well. Right, so the occurrence of anthracnose. Well, I guess it's important to know from the start that infection from anthracnose can take two forms. Okay, essentially there's a basal rot form and there's a foliar blight form. And all the main textbooks will cover these two in terms of their occurrence and what they look like. But it's important to think about, really, they are the same disease, just affecting different parts of the plant, but under slightly different environmental conditions.
Well, this was when we did the quiz, the sort of 10 questions, we got a really good sort of uptake on that. So, but it kind of became clear when we're sort of looking at the results, that there might be some gaps in knowledge going on, which might actually be one of the reasons why the disease is on the increase. You never know. We take so much for granted. But this was one of the questions that this is actually the one that most people got wrong. That people thought that the sort of both forms of the disease were favoured in the same conditions. But which to some degree they are. It might have been a bit of a nuanced question, but it's just what we wanted to do during this presentation is just kind of pick up on those ones where those questions where people were sort of there was a lot of wrong answers going on, and just make sure that we reinforce those ones so people had a clear understanding of that situation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So we can think about these two forms a little bit more. So we start with foliar blight, and it's important to understand foliar blight can affect all the main turfgrass species. Generally occurs under periods of high temperature and humidity, when the turf is under stress. Now, there can be a range of stresses impacting that through, as we've already mentioned, moisture stress, heat stress, but also, compaction, wear, and those sorts of stresses as well. So we get it into those periods of high temperature and humidity. And generally, the models that look at anthracnose would say, well, it's about temperature, and it's about increasing hours of leaf wetness. And those two factors add together to increase the amount of infected plants from the foliar blight. So we think of it about temperature and humidity. So it's common in those regions that experience those conditions. So generally the summer period, often when the soil is dry, when we're irrigating frequently to try and get some moisture down into the root zone, potentially the leaf stays a little bit damp, we get the development of foliar blight and anthracnose. Symptoms have been reported over quite a broad range of temperatures, but would generally say the focus of temperatures is the high 20s into the 30s, and that's when we see the largest amount of foliar blight outbreaks.
Yeah. I mean, I've spent all my agronomic career and subsequent career in the north of England, and I've definitely seen it, but not very often. So yeah, those high temperatures are a big driver. So there might be some foliar blight about down south at the moment, because those temperatures really are high.
And it's humid as well in a lot of regions.
Yeah, water will be going on. There's some thunder about as well, isn't there? So it's highly relevant, I would say, even though we haven't seen it much in the course of our career. It doesn't mean that it's not sort of lurking or something that you should be kind of keeping an eye out for at the moment, because it can be really damaging.
Absolutely, yeah. We would generally identify that as a sort of a yellowing, patches that might turn sort of bronze. It's sometimes quite difficult to identify. Can be misidentified perhaps as a little bit of drought stress showing on the surface. So it's that sort of level. But if you see patches of your turf suffering more and you look closely at the leaves, you should be able to see this core diagnostic feature for anthracnose, which is these black spined, effectively acevuli. Okay, they're diagnostic features, and I think you can see in this picture, this is what they look like. These pictures taken from University of Massachusetts in the US, and we often use disease pictures from the web because they will have been taken under really controlled conditions, so they provide a really good indication of the key characteristic factors. But essentially here we see this sort of black spine structures on the leaf of the plant, which is diagnostic for both forms of anthracnose. You can see them yourself if you've got a ×10 hand lens, but they don't look anything like as clear as that. Here's a sort of picture that would be possible with a phone and a ×10 hand lens. You can see the same black dots, but nowhere near as clear to see. Okay, so that would be a foliar blight, but then we think about basal rot anthracnose, maybe one that's more common to a lot of people, certainly the one that I see most regularly. And generally we would say basal rot anthracnose affects Poa annua, but can also infect creeping bentgrass as a key species, and it can be more severe than foliar blight. So you get more turf death than you would see in the foliar blight version of the disease. And for annual meadowgrass, it can occur over wider temperatures. There is a risk in spring and autumn, and maybe right the way through the winter if conditions are suitable. And so here's the difference really. Basal rot anthracnose is not necessarily associated with the higher temperatures, but it is associated with moisture and stress on the plant. And so that would be one of the key things to think about. Now, that's notwithstanding the fact that basal rot anthracnose will occur in hot conditions and can occur more severely, but we will also get it in cooler conditions if the other factors are associated. That reference,
that's the nuance, isn't it, that we were talking about with the question.
Yeah, exactly right. That reference there at the bottom, the chemical control of turfgrass diseases, is available online, is a really informative source of information about a lot of the diseases and how we manage them. And so so that would be one I'd recommend people do an internet search for and put into their own libraries, because it's a useful one going forward.
Okay.
So basal rot anthracnose can occur at key times through the year. One of the times, for example, that we do see it on Poa annua is that period just following the seeding of Poa annua. The thought is that the annual plant puts a lot of metabolic energy into producing seed heads, and after that it suffers from a lot of stress, and so we can see that sort of early summer period anthracnose coming in just through that time. I certainly see it quite commonly myself at that time. So we would identify basal rot anthracnose, simply a yellowing, I think, of individual plants in the sward or individual leaf blades from individual plants in the sward. And if we look closer, these leaf blades or plants can be pulled or plucked quite easily from the surface, because essentially the basal rot has rotted through the crown of the plant, and that crown is colonized by the fungus, and so yeah, can be pulled away quite easily. Often in early stages, you can see infected plants that exhibit both healthy and infected tillers on the plant. And there are some key images I think we see a lot when we talk about anthracnose that are pulled from online libraries. This one from Washington State University, showing this very sort of yellowing of the leaf in the sward. And this one as well, I think we see quite commonly, which has a good focus on that crown or base of the plant, and you can see those black specks, those acereale, appearing on the base of the leaf, and that leaf can be pulled out from the plant.
Yeah, I might be showing my age here, Andy, but when I started my agronomic career all those years ago, people were still calling it annual meadowgrass dieback. And so those symptoms were a consequence of the annual nature of Poa annua, rather than being as a result of fungal pathogen. And of course, we know better now. But sort of even then, even sort of in the early 90s. All those years ago, it was almost like kind of considered to be sort of one of those things that just happens, rather than being something that you could do anything about. Yeah. We see with this form, the basal rot, that the disease can progress and become really severe. Those individual plants coalesce, they die, larger irregular patches appear, and can be disastrous for playing surfaces under the wrong conditions. Again, basal rot, an indicator is these black specks, these sort of spine-like structures on the leaf of tissue that you can see, and within those spine-like structures are the asexual spores of the anthracnose, which then allow the disease to spread through its life cycle. You can pull these pictures off, say, the Syngenta website, and it is clear again, some really strong pictures showing these unique structures and one of the key identification features. And the life cycle, is really fairly straightforward. We have overwintering of the spores or mycelium. We then get
a susceptible plant that is under stress, suitable environmental conditions, and we get the disease developing either as the basal rot form or as the foliar blight, both of which will, develop asexual spores, which can then be spread onto healthy plants. Those plants will become infected, will die, become treated, and the spores will overwinter. So a very straightforward life cycle. Again, but it's good to have a bit of an understanding of what's going on. The disease basically can overwinter very easily, both in infected tissue or in the thatch, and so come to light when the environmental conditions allow. So we can move on to think about the control of anthracnose, and necessarily, suggest that fungicide should be the first thing that are thought about, but it's important to tick those off and to show that anthracnose can be managed with fungicide applications. Certainly, you would only see good success from fungicide applications when they're applied preventatively, and the recommendations always are that they're applied well in advance of the classic symptoms that you might see. So up to 4 weeks in advance of the classic symptoms. This is because infection occurs well before those symptoms become apparent. And obviously the pathogen increases when conditions are right, when the stress levels have increased. And by the time you see those sort of yellow leaf on the plant, the anthracnose is fully taken hold of the plant, has already rotted through the leaf blade. That leaf blade going yellow is because there's no nutrition coming up from the roots at all. So effectively it is dying. Okay.
It was interesting, this one, Andy, with the quiz, that it wasn't the one that most people got wrong, but it was where a significant amount of people said that they felt that sort of modern fungicides aren't effective against anthracnose. The sort of Syngenta portfolio that we have in the UK and Ireland, we've got sort of Heritage, Strata, Elite, Medallion. They're all very effective against anthracnose, but it might just be that kind of opinion is kind of based on the fact that maybe it's being used after the event. These fungicides are being used at the wrong time, that they're not being applied preventatively, and that after the damage has been done, the fungicide is not going to miraculously mend the damaged tissue, is it? So I think that's a really important point. That's one of those kind of key learnings, is that actually, no, the fungicides really do work, but you need to time them properly, and that requires you to sort of use your knowledge and understanding of past history and the prevailing conditions and the soil composition and the intensity of your maintenance to sort of make that sort of timing decision correctly.
Yeah. Certainly the work that's been done on fungicides shows that slightly higher water volumes are more effective than lower water volumes. And they do show that fungicides perform better when we're reducing the level of turf stress as a management practice. So you might be slightly more tolerant with your heights of cut, or you have a plant that is not nutritionally impoverished, and so your nitrogen and your potassium rates are appropriate. So that's something to bear in mind. We could also tick off that there are some cultivar level differences. You can look at the National Turf Grass Evaluation Program from the States, and they measure anthracnose when they see it and provide tables. So within the creeping bent family, there are differences between different cultivars, but in reality that difference is not high. When we look at the LSD value of 2, that effectively means there's no significant difference between most of these cultivars, and it's only these bottom ones, perhaps some of the older ones, that would perform significantly worse than some of the others. So there are small cultivar level differences to be aware of.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
you've already mentioned the sort of species level differences, and they are, you know, they are important. We shouldn't sort of forget host susceptibility as being a massive influencing factor, just because, you know, the whole thorny subject of sword composition and sword composition change is kind of, you know, I mean, it's a toughie, isn't it? But we
Yeah.
shouldn't ignore that, you know, and I think everyone gets that. Actually, we sort of did a survey, you know, that survey of course managers that you sort of referenced right at the start of this thing. One of the questions was about sort of what, you know, how the future lies, and there was quite a big sort of move to sort of say, yeah, we understand that we might need to take the grass composition of our turf surfaces more seriously in golf, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, let's not sort of gloss over it. But we're going to have to talk about that some other time, I would say.
I think it would be nice to put together some good trial work and collect all the data on that species transition and talk a little about that. Watch this space, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so that really moves us to something. I think the one of the key pieces of work that we want to highlight in this webinar, a big trial, a major trial that was done in the US, a multi-state research project that ran for a number of years and has had subsequent offshoots. It was looking at fungicides, but it also focused in a lot on porannual management practices. Okay, and it was aiming to build sort of the best management practice guidelines, so these BMP guidelines. Been heavily published. There was a nice review published in 2015, another summary review published in 2018, but there's a whole series of peer-reviewed papers and then backup industry articles on this. And it is so good, we wanted to focus on this a little bit. Okay, so here are the headlines from that 2018 study. You know, anthracnose on annual bluegrass turf, best management practices, and that subheading is really the critical one. Essentially, this says it all. In many cases, a combination of cultural practices can effectively suppress anthracnose, eliminating the need for fungicides, unless there's a very severe outbreak. It does say in the text. So something really good to think about. This trial work over a series of years focused on our nutritional strategy, focused on top dressing, and focused on mowing practice. And then in sort of offshoots also covered use of plant growth regulators, rolling, double cutting turf ironing. It covered verticutting and some forms of aeration, and looked at irrigation as well. So a multifaceted trial, lots of really interesting data coming out from that. Okay, and the first part would be to consider anthracnose and nutrition. And essentially, the severity of the anthracnose outbreak can be linked to deficiency of nitrogen in the turf. Okay, and
yeah, sorry to interrupt. So what you're
no,
sort of saying there is that the sort of, you know, the infection is kind of not to do with that, but how the kind of disease developed was very much related to the nutritional strategy and nitrogen in particular.
Yeah. The severity of the outbreak. That's exactly right. Yeah, and the trial work. Okay, so it was done in a number of US states. You know, the rates that they're focused on here might not be the same as the rates that we might be applying across Europe, but essentially they showed that applying 5 to 10 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per week really showed significant reduction in outbreak. Now that's a lot, we appreciate that's a lot, but they also showed that lower rates, you know, maybe just 2 or 3 kilograms of N per hectare per week, when stresses are reduced, other stresses that is are reduced, makes a significant difference as well. They saw increase.
We don't have to take. Sorry, Andy. We don't have to take this sort of work as a prescription, do we? You know, we're using this to sort of build our understanding of what the key influencing factors are. So I don't want anyone to get sort of hot and bothered about the numbers here. I just kind of want them to sort of see the influences, you know, because sometimes you can switch people off by talking about high fertilizers. They kind of throw their hands up. And, you know, these are just parameters that were in the study. You know, they might not be entirely relevant to all territories, but you know, stay with it. It's kind of like, it's powerful.
Absolutely, absolutely. Essentially, they were saying the key was to maintain nitrogen in the plant at an even level. So regular spoon feeding with liquids or application of a slow release granular fertilizer through the summer helps a lot. They found that spring applications of granular fertilizer were important as well. So that sort of keeping the turf well fed, not impoverished, did make a difference in terms of the severity of the outbreak.
We can learn from that, can't we?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. You don't want to starve your plant in the summer. The work progressed, was really interesting. They split down the nitrogen levels into nitrogen source. So here's a figure. We have disease severity up the y-axis. We have time across the bottom. The dotted line you can see is the control. Severe anthracnose outbreak, which is significantly reduced through the application of nitrogen, but is also significantly reduced by selecting potassium nitrate over ammonium sulfate, which is an interesting result. Essentially, the potassium nitrate gave the best results and raised the question, so is that result just because of the form of nitrogen that is being taken up by the plant? Or is there an additional effect of potassium nutrition, or even an additional effect of pH? There'll be a slightly potentially an adjustment in the pH depending on whether nitrate is taken up by the plant or whether ammonium is taken up by the plant. So there's a couple of questions that work raised, and there were some subsequent follow-up studies looking at potassium rather than nitrogen. So they essentially showed that the severity of the anthracnose outbreak was also linked to deficiencies in potassium. And the work was really good, really clear, that effectively showed that a soil analysis of your potassium levels showed that lower than 40 to 50 ppm from a Malic 3 extraction gave you greater anthracnose severity. We can look at the figure from this, okay, a little bit to get our heads around to start with. So the y-axis is this metric called area under disease progress curve. So effectively all the area under that time progression of the disease. And then on this x-axis, we have the amount of potassium measured in the soil. And the work sort of identified this cutoff point, this sweet spot of round about 45 ppm of potassium that we need to try and keep in the root zone to maintain or reduce the severity of the anthracnose outbreak. So the trial work showed you don't need to put on excessive potassium through the summer, but rates of 50 to 200 kilograms per hectare per year all greatly reduced your anthracnose outbreak. You didn't see more anthracnose at higher rates with potassium. The key again was to maintaining anthracnose in the leaf. Sorry, go on, Henry.
No, it's all right. I mean, it's just kind of one of these things that sometimes, you know, the sort of results of trial work comes out and people sort of almost like get the wrong end of the stick and start thinking with something like this, you know, well, I have to apply loads of potassium. And it's not saying that at all, is it? It's saying you have to avoid deficiencies. Yeah. I mean, that level there that they're sort of talking about in the soil is quite low, isn't it? You know, and it's kind of like, just make sure that that's not happening. So it does kind of point to the importance of soil analysis for one thing, just to sort of keep an eye on the situation, but this is not saying pile on the potash.
Yeah, exactly right. Okay. The work also looked at differences in potassium nutrition types. There seemed to be less of a difference between potassium nutrition types than there were with nitrogen. Just picked out this figure, which effectively shows disease severity up the y-axis, and there's a lot going on here, but this red line is essentially your control. and the black line shows a significant reduction just with applications of potassium. But that group of 4 lines at the bottom is essentially showing the difference that nitrogen and potassium make. So by making sure that we're not deficient in N and K makes a bigger difference than one or the other. So just something to bear in mind. The nutritional status of the plant and the soil is important.
Yeah, and we're sort of, you know, this is integrated disease management, isn't it? And so it's kind of like we're not just focusing on one thing, we're focusing on all those things and putting together sort of combinations of treatments to sort of, you know, so they compound each other. And there's a clear example there of just playing with the sort of macronutrients, that the kind of impact that you can have.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also quite interestingly was the effect of root zone pH, which was looked at. They found that the root zone pH was not critical, not as critical as the nitrogen and potassium, but they did show that as we moved to more moderately acidic root zones, they described those as less than 5.5, pH 5.5, got more anthracnose severity. And a raising of the pH greater than 6 reduced the anthracnose severity. So root zone pH does play a part, but less of a part perhaps than the macronutrition.
Yes, and that was one of the questions that, again, that seemed to sort of point to a slight misunderstanding, because there was quite a significant proportion of the answers to the question, you know, does a high pH increase the likelihood of anthracnose developing? And a lot of people seem to think that it did, whereas actually it's the other way around. It's a kind of low pH. So yeah, so just be clear on that. Is like a high pH, you know, is not a massive influencing factor, but again, soil analysis just to check that you're not sort of going too far with the pH, or just kind of just to sort of, you know, almost with something like that, it's just assess the risk. It really is what the soil analysis is doing there, isn't it? So there we go.
Exactly right. I mean, I guess if you're managing annual meadowgrass surfaces and you've got a reducing pH, then the risk of anthracnose is going to increase, and so you need to be aware of that in terms of what you have planned. Okay.
Exactly. Now, Andy, we have had a question before we move on from. I think this is the point where we move on from nutrition and soil status, isn't it?
Yes, you're right.
So look, there's a question here from Magnus. Thank you, Magnus. Oh, but he's left. It says that he's left the. Anyway, maybe he'll watch.
He'll watch the recording.
Yes. Will any form of soil amendment or biological maintenance help against anthracnose, or is it just nutrition levels? You know, so we talked about how influential nutrition is. What about that kind of other stuff? You know, the sort of biological biostimulant, you know, your amino stress relief kind of stuff. Was there any, when you read those 43 papers, was there any work done on that?
Very little focus on amendments, biologicals, biostimulants in that work. And it's very tricky to answer that without the scientific evidence alongside. You know, if we're talking broadly about amendments, you know, an amendment that would raise your pH a little bit or prevent your pH from dropping is going to be helpful.
I see what you mean.
So that would be something to consider. Over application of organics can lower your pH, okay, as your organics break down. So again, might be something to consider. But in terms of biologicals, I mean, there has been work to show that some of the fungicides can be partly effective in the management of anthracnose, as we see with many diseases, but often they're not the answer on their own. They need to be integrated into a program of other practices to reduce your disease outbreak completely. But they do have some effect. I think when we get into the territory of the biostimulants, you know, we talk about seaweeds or humic acids or amino acids, the story becomes much more complex. You know, we might be trying to provide a healthier plant, but you know, it is difficult to separate the effects of a general program from those effects, and I wouldn't want to make too much of a comment. Of course, aminos can be used to provide nitrogen to the plant, and so they will be helpful in that situation. It might not be, you know, something else going on, but there's undoubtedly
nothing special to the sort of, you know, the biological kind of nature of it, if you see what I mean. It's kind of like, it's just kind of, you know, nitrogen.
Yeah, nothing that came out in that research trial work, but undoubtedly there's more that can be done.
Doesn't mean that it's not there, but it's just that it's not been proven yet. Okay, carry on, Andy.
Okay, thank you. So we move away from our nutrition and root zone and think about some of the management practices. Mowing height is another clear one, you know, and obviously we use height of cut to improve ball roll distance across the surface of our greens. And the work was quite clear, showing that lower heights of cut increased the severity of the anthracnose attack. It's pulled this table out of some of the trial work, and essentially here, you know, we're going from 2.8 mils, just relaxing the height of cut to 3.6 mils, and we get a significant reduction in anthracnose, but you know, it's not the complete story. We're just saying that it helps to relax the height of cut where possible.
So Andy, you can answer another question for me. We've had one from Peter. Sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, Peter. He's sort of saying, what cutting height should be employed to avoid the disease? To avoid it?
Yeah, I mean, you need to reduce that stress on the surface. So the tactful answer would be the highest height of cut you can get away with while still maintaining the playing quality that you want to achieve at your club. You know,
a lot of this work saying that what we're talking about with a lot of these measures is sort of almost like reducing the severity of the attack. It's not sort of about preventing infection, is it? It's about sort of what happens afterwards. And so, yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. You know, we should be, you know, maintaining playing qualities in the least stressful way, I suppose, is one way of putting it. But I don't think that there's any way of avoiding it apart from the use of preventative use of fungicide.
And species transition potentially.
Yeah, fungicides that Peter might not have available to him.
Yeah. That's right. The work did show that frequency of mowing or mowing and rolling did not increase the development of the disease. So if you can get away with a slightly higher height of cut and do these additional maintenance practices to maintain ball roll distance, that could be quite useful, and that would be a general recommendation, as you've just said. We can also look at top dressing. Obviously, we would generally top dress regularly through the year to reduce the influence of organic matter, to dilute that organic matter accumulation, and to firm up the surface, provide a smooth ball roll, obviously. And there was no negative influence of top dressing. So increased top dressing didn't increase anthracnose. Okay, and the work did show that light and frequent top dressing did considered to be the best outcome, but heavier and less frequent top dressing was also beneficial. Now, I know it can be very difficult to get on the amounts of top dressing that you want through a busy playing calendar, but if you can maintain your levels of top dressing, that will help. If you have some choices to make, top dressing in the spring at heavier rates was more effective at managing anthracnose than top dressing in the autumn. And I think, you know, again, an image borrowed from this work done at Rutgers from Bruce Clark, very clear here. The thought from that work was that the higher rates of top dressing help to protect the crown of the plant. And if we're protecting the crown of the plant, we have less stress on the plant. So maybe the development of anthracnose is slowed or is not as severe. And so really that's the idea behind our sort of frequent top dressing. And then the additional comments from all this work were, wounding of the plant, so brushing or verticutting or angular top dressing or increased wear didn't seem to increase the severity of the attack. But the work was clear that irrigation is important, and managing your turf to show some stress, so not replacing your evapotranspiration rates completely, did make a difference. So trying to get the right amount of water on through irrigation is important, but also bearing in mind you need to reduce your leaf wetness time. And alongside that, use of wetting agents would be eminently sensible, but they've not been a focus of a lot of those published papers, but they would make a lot of sense in terms of building into the program. Okay. And then there was another piece of work that looked at plant growth regulation, and the outcome really was that it would not increase your anthracnose, which is good. And on one occasion of 3 years of the study, then your plant growth regulator applications did reduce the level of anthracnose. But again, there would be a sensible application to make to maintain turf quality and playing quality going forward. Okay.
Can I just stop there? Then we had a question from Frederick there, who was saying, what is AM irrigation? That's morning irrigation.
Yeah. Application in the morning, that's quite right. Yeah, just to cover that up rather than application late on. So you're reducing the amount of time that leaf stays wet. Okay, sorry for not being clear. That's good. Okay, and then that moves to where this work from the US and Rutgers and that research group really moved to a really interesting piece of trial work that looked at the interaction of best management practices, okay, these BMPs. So when we think about using fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer particularly, we think about relaxing mowing heights, we think about more top dressing. How do those factors interact? I find this work so good. It looked at interactions between, for nitrogen, for best management practice versus a low rate of nitrogen. So in this case, they were looking at 200 versus 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, okay? Considered best management practice versus low for this site.
Interesting.
They looked at top dressing, so effectively best management practice versus low rates of top dressing. So over the course of a year, applying 80 tons of top dressing versus 40 tons of top dressing. And then best management practice in terms of height of cut, say considered to be, say, 3.2 versus a lower mowing height, 2.3. And looked at how all those interacted. And the work is nicely summarized in one figure, which is there's a whole range of things that can be said. And here effectively we have, the amount of anthracnose up the y-axis. We obviously have time up the x-axis, and we can look at this figure in a number of ways. But we can compare these open circles, which is not the control. It's not nothing going on. It is essentially the low rate of nitrogen, the lower height of cut, and the low rate of sand. And you can compare those open circles with these closed circles at the bottom, which is the best management practice for each of those. So higher rate of nitrogen, relaxed height of cut, more sand going on. And there is a huge difference in terms of the outbreak of anthracnose under those conditions. So essentially, greater nitrogen was effective, and that a combination of best management practices helped suppress anthracnose, without use of fungicides, to less than 10% in the majority of the trial period. Okay, that is illustrated a little bit more in this figure. don't want to dwell too long on it. Effectively, here we have that metric area under disease progression curve. And essentially, we've got two comparisons going on here. For low nitrogen, we've got this comparison between low rate of sand and higher rate of sand, so 40 to 80 tons of sand per hectare per year, significantly reduces your outbreak. And at higher rates of nitrogen, going from low to high rates of sand, significantly reduces your outbreak. But the critical thing really is this reduction here that is going from your low rate of nitrogen to your higher rate of nitrogen. So again, just showing that getting your nutritional, your macronutrition right makes a bigger difference than the other things. So the higher rate of N is more important. Okay.
Of course. It's not like, I mean, it is a massive difference, isn't it? But I mean, of course.
Yeah. You need to keep the plant.
Nutrition is so important. Yeah.
Okay, so we then come on to these best management practices and what they show. Well, essentially, if you can increase rates of nitrogen, relaxed mowing and increased sand top dressing had the most effect. But this work does recognize that playing quality, particularly ball roll distance, did drop. And so if you need to maintain your ball roll distance in terms of your playing quality, then the recommendation came out that best management practice for top dressing, higher rates, and for nitrogen could be utilized to reduce the disease and maybe lower your height of cut to increase your ball roll if you have no other options. But there's a higher risk by relaxing all three of these things together. And really, that's where this sort of integrated work has led. We can look at the research, okay, which was carried out in the US, which was related to the specific conditions there, but they were saying that appropriate macronutrition, nitrogen and potassium, will reduce your anthracnose outbreak. Okay, relaxing your mowing heights a little bit, potentially increasing mowing frequency or rolling to maintain ball roll will make a difference. Regular light top dressings to hit target amounts of sand going on is important. Obviously, we have the preventative use of the right fungicides applied early enough will be effective as well. And this linked to non-stress irrigation. So making sure we're watering to replace evapotranspiration and not putting that plant under drought stress during these periods would be important. So if we look at these, Henry, coming from the trial, would you say they're relevant to the UK conditions and what you recognise?
Yeah, I do actually, and I kind of think it's difficult not to look at the graphs, the best management practice graphs, and just kind of go, oh my goodness, just how influential the kind of best management practice kind of stuff is. And just speaking from sort of the UK and Ireland perspective, I think if we were going to sort of do a sort of state of play kind of analysis, I kind of think that sort of the level of nutrition that we're talking about in here would be, people would balk at that. People use a lot lower than that. And they really, they do push their heights of cut down low. And maybe don't like using fungicides for anthracnose. And with non-stress irrigation, a lot of people are pushing their greens really hard. So it comes as no surprise that anthracnose is kind of really sort of quite prevalent. So I think, I don't think that we should just kind of treat this as a recipe. I think what we should do is kind of learn from it and just kind of almost like sort of say, yeah, have I got my nutrition right? I'm looking at my soil status. Are there factors there that I'm sort of unaware of? Is my nitrogen inputs level sort of right on the run up to that kind of period? My cutting height, is it possible for me to maintain playing qualities, a raised cutting height with top dressing and rolling, etc., etc.? We've always said that. And the irrigation is a funny one, but it's kind of it is a bit weird because you could read this as sort of say, well, you want me to feed and water my greens more? And it's kind of like, and so it's definitely not saying that. But I mean, you know, there are broader agronomic aims within every program, not just to prevent anthracnose. So we do have to kind of fit this stuff into our broader objectives as well. But yeah, I think we should be looking at them and looking at these kind of things and being influenced by them, certainly not sort of necessarily sort of you know, adopting them without thought, but just kind of like the power of the work is so strong that, you know, you can't ignore it.
No, that's right. I think you know, I think research is there to learn from and to try and adapt to your own current situation. I think what the research shows is that you don't have to be at the mercy of anthracnose, and there are management practices that can be put into place depending on your situation to reduce the severity of your outbreak. That is something that needs to be thought about. So that's come to the end of my slides.
We do
Did
have some questions.
further questions, Henry? Do you want to
Yes, we do. We do.
feed them in?
Yeah, so I'm gonna ask them to you, Andy, because it sort of absolves me of any kind of responsibility of actually coming up with a coherent answer. One of them is, what was the sward species composition in the best management practice trial? Was it sort of POA, creeping bent, or both? What were we sort of dealing with in those trials?
We're dealing with majority Poaranua swards. Yeah. So you know, susceptible host to anthracnose, and hence we were seeing those high levels of disease occurring in that trial work.
Yeah.
And so you know, that's something to bear in mind as well.
Yeah, so a real reflection of UK and Ireland greens. And we've got a question here. Magnus is back, which is good. Thanks, Magnus. We thought we'd lost you. He's saying, you know, he's obviously in a sort of different territory. So what if you're not allowed to use fungicides? I mean, for me, I would just kind of sort of say, well, you've got to look at that, you know, be influenced by those best management practice stuff and take on board all the things that they were suggesting. You know, they're sort of the best, you know, nitrogen, cutting height and top dressing, yes, but they also kind of found stuff on, you know, rolling, plant growth regulators and all this and the other. You might not have plant growth regulators, but you just kind of got to draw everything together, I would say. And maybe you have to sort of lower the expectation for playing qualities at certain times as well, or try and manage that. What do you think?
No, that's a almost a perfect answer, Henry. I'd say you'd also got to look at the long-term plan to maybe reduce your sort of host susceptibility and look at adjusting your species if you can. It isn't possible in every situation, but that will help as well. You know, for basal anthracnose, Poaranua is one of the, you know, critical susceptible.
Gosh, it does all go back to that, doesn't it? You can't sort of not talk about disease and sort of, you know, not get into the dreaded subject of grass types. I mean, for God's sake, we got burned by that before, didn't we? We do have some other ones. You touched on this before, Andy, but it seems so obvious now. But maybe we're sort of just a bit late to the party on some of this stuff. But is there any research which indicates the positive effect of using surfactants in combination with balanced sort of availability fertilizer levels? So yeah, that effective moisture management, you touched on it, but it sounds, we've talked about this before, it sounds like there's not a lot of research on this, and we need to do
there's not a lot of published research. There are one or two trials. Ones I'm thinking of weren't necessarily peer reviewed and published, but they did put a wetting agent in a bunch of nutritional approaches. But the trial work was interesting because it never separated out the effect of the wetting agent on its own. So you can't really conclude from the trial work I'm thinking about the effect the wetting agent had, which was a flaw in that trial work maybe. But it did show that it was part of a package which had a bit of an effect. It was interesting when I was talking to Kate Entwistle. She did say that she sometimes sees anthracnose where you have infiltration problems and you have a buildup of hydrophobicity, because water will sit on the surface, not infiltrate, and so the crown of the plant stays wet. And obviously we use wetting agents to prevent that buildup of hydrophobicity. So yes, I would say they would be a crucial part of your anthracnose management. They would be sensible in terms of keeping your root zone moisture levels at the level you need so that the plant stays healthy. So yeah, good question, and should be part of it, but there hasn't been much peer-reviewed work that looks at those that I found.
No, but you would adopt sensible surfactant use, wouldn't you? Just based on that kind of common sense logic. But it'd be nice to get the evidence, because sometimes, you know, things aren't what they, you know, seem. Sometimes common sense isn't quite right. What about the sharpness of blades? Was there any work on that? You know, I know it sort of said that sort of verticutting or sort of damage and stuff like that didn't sort of influence things, but you've got to think that sort of a non-macerated cut or a very clean cut would be, you know, would be less sort of draining of the plant. You know, I don't know.
I agree completely. I can't recall sharpness of blade being one of the parameters that were looked at, but it has sort of got to make sense in terms of doing what you can to reduce the stress on the plant. So you know, that would make perfect sense to me.
It would, but we're on dodgy ground if we start sort of saying stuff like that, don't we? So
they showed that obviously verticutting, they showed that stiff brushing after top dressing didn't increase anthracnose, you know, and so maybe it is only a very minor influencing factor, but taken as a whole, you've got to say it's a sensible approach.
Yeah, we got a question from Darren, which is kind of quite a good question in the sense that, you know, almost like, does the disease perpetuate itself? He's saying, you know, is it possible that as we have plant death, the dead plants become a rotten slime in the base of the sward and seal the surface, creating further plant loss or the conditions for even more development? And that's undoubtedly true, isn't it? I would think. But you know, certainly it's kind of a source of spores and stuff like that as well, you know. But it's kind of, it does run out of control, doesn't it? And I think that that's probably a consequence of it. I don't know. I'm just making it up.
No, you're right. I mean, anthracnose, Colletotrichum, you know, cereale will overwinter or stay as mycelium and spores in dead and decaying turf matter, and so if it's sitting there in the base, it's going to be a source of infection going into the following season or when conditions allow through the season. So yeah, I'd agree.
Okay, how are we doing for time, Andy?
Well, we've overrun a little bit, so I don't know if there's anything else you think we need to address.
We've got one, just only one or two quickies. You know, the only reason why I'm sort of saying that is I don't know that you would know the answer to them. So, but you know, I'll ask. Yeah, we can say, well, I don't really know if we don't know the answer. How does the afternoon syringing of greens on hot days impact on outbreaks, as this increases the humidity around the crown of the plant? Yeah, it's a funny one. This whole irrigation strategy does seem to be kind of pivotal, especially during these kind of conditions. I don't know what the answer to that would be. There might be some work on it. Did you see any in the
No, not really.
Timing of irrigation.
Yeah.
Yeah, you might be. The point being is you might be making matters worse, mightn't you? Yeah, it's a really good question. Get the research.
But then you do need to run your irrigation. You need to keep, you know, moisture getting into the root zone, and there's things to consider there. I mean, period of leaf wetness is a clear indicator of the development of the disease, particularly with foliar blight. So just have to be cautious of that, I think.
Those guys would know, wouldn't they? The Rutger guys would know that. So what are the treatments to aid recovery at this time of year if you have an outbreak? Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, you know, it's not just about preventing it, is it? It's about sort of recovering it. And so it's just your normal stuff, isn't it? You just got to sort of catch it early, stop it in its tracks if you can, you know. Sort of fungicide application will sort of do its best to kill the disease activity or prevent it spiraling out of control. Then it's kind of nutrition, overseeding, and sort of just generally trying to sort of ease back to sort of generate recovery. But actually, it's not easy. This is the problem with this disease. You know, I sort of remember all the severe attacks around about this time of year, and there's a long period of pain associated with an anthracnose disease attack. You know, recovery is not easy. It's easy to say all those things, but that's why it must be avoided, because you know, it's once you get it, it's serious damage for a long time, I would say.
Yeah, and if you're not focused on that recovery of the surface, the gaps in the canopy from anthracnose are going to lead to more annual meadowgrass moss coming in the autumn and deterioration of your surface conditions. So yeah, it is a tricky one.
Okay, that is all the questions. Thank you for asking your questions. Really good. Andy, I'm going to leave it to you. I thought that was really good.
Yeah, so thanks, Henry. Thanks for those questions. I guess all left to say is I hope you found that interesting. We have recorded this webinar, so it will appear via a link on our website. If you want to review it again or send it on somewhere, send the link on, so please do that. Keep your eye out for the other anthracnose items if you've not come across them. Our short technical update videos, effectively our talking head videos, 3 of those. The quiz is probably still available if you wanted to now.
Yeah, you might win a goodie bag.
After listening to us talk and see if you can get 100%, please do that.
Yes.
And we will leave it there. We hope to do future webinars in this series over the coming weeks and months. So keep your eye out for those. Thanks for listening. Our emails are on the slide. Feel free to drop us a line if you want to make any comments.
Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, cheers, Andy. Cheers all.
Yeah, thanks everybody.